Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Now, if you'll just excuse me, I'm just going to start by handing over to a consultant who's giving me 3 tips to try and improve this podcast and just make it that bit more popular.
All you have to do is follow 3 simple rules. 1, never underestimate your opponent. Expect the unexpected. 2, take it outside. Never start anything inside the bar unless it's absolutely necessary. And 3, be nice.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, production stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to make a movie. Without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the first of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going back to the 1980s. We're going back to action. We're going back to Patrick Swayze ruling the box office. Let me play you a clip from the first of the movies I'm going to talk about. The story's the other side of this.
Can I buy you guys a drink? Guess not.
Patrick Swayze is
Dalton.
I thought you'd be bigger.
Opinions vary.
When he's around, anything can happen,
How does a guy like you end up a bouncer?
Just lucky, I guess.
and usually does.
If somebody gets in your face, I want you to be nice.
Don't be rude.
Ask him to walk, but be nice.
Help this gentleman to the door.
Until it's time to not be nice.
So says the fighting philosopher.
And that, of course, was a clip from Roadhouse from 1989, directed by Rowdy Herrington, screenplay credited to David Lee Henry and Hilary Henkin, with a story from David Lee Henry, starring Patrick Swayze, Ben Gazzara, Kelly Lynch and Sam Elliott. And the story of Roadhouse, well, it goes back to those writers, as most of our tales tend to do. It was in February 1988 that the first reports landed in the Hollywood trade press of a script coming to light called Roadhouse, written by R. Lance Hill, ultimately under the pseudonym of David Lee Henry and Hilary Henkin. And their script was soon picked up by an action-hungry Joel Silver, a notable producer of action movies throughout the 80s and 90s, and he was keen to get this one moving. Set up at MGM United Artists, the film was a project that Silver was fast-tracking really to the screen. Now, separately, a director by the name of Rowdy Herrington, whose real name is Howard Herrington, had enjoyed a hit at this stage with his first movie, a film called Jack's Black, starring James Spader. And Joel Silver was scouting for up-and-coming directors, really. It's notable that he worked with a lot of independent or up-and-coming directors over whom he would wield a reasonable amount of producer control. And Herrington's name had crossed his desk, and so he arranged a meeting between the pair of them. Now, as Rowdy Herrington would tell the outlet Uproxx in an interview he did with them a couple of years ago, he was actually signed to the same agency that represented Patrick Swayze at this point, and so he got the call from Silver to go in for a meeting. The meeting took place against the backdrop of the film Die Hard being shot, and so he would meet the cast and crew of Die Hard, and he would meet with Joel Silver at midnight, apparently. That's when they first had their chat, and Silver broached the idea of, well, do you fancy directing this film Roadhouse? Now, Herrington hadn't really liked the script for Roadhouse, and he was very open with Silver about his concerns, and by this stage Patrick Swayze was already attached to the project. I'll come to him shortly. But Herrington said it was too broad, and that I felt like Patrick, coming off of Dirty Dancing, was going to have a large female audience. And he said, as it turned out in the end, Joel Silver put a lot of stuff back in that I cut out of the movie. Now, Swayze was in the first flush, really, of his huge box office successes that he had over his career. The second wave would come with 1990's Ghost that I've covered before. But Dirty Dancing was the one that really put him on the map. It brought him particularly a large female fan base, and the romantic hit, appreciating there's a lot of dark stuff in Dirty Dancing, was a perennial video performer already at this stage as well. But he followed it up with a serious family drama called Tiger Warsaw, and the box office dollars didn't really flow on that one, and so he took the jump fully towards action cinema. He looked at the script for Roadhouse, decided there was enough in there, and he was in. He signed on the dotted line. Now, as much at this stage, he wasn't particularly known for action. I mean, he'd appeared in he was in Red Dawn, for instance. The role of Dalton, the lead role of Dalton, was going to be very, very action-centric. And Swayze's background was in performance, was in dance, you saw it in Dirty Dancing. And he'd come up through theatre as well. And his joints were certainly flexible, even though he was carrying a growing number of injuries that I'll come to shortly. Still, there was going to be a bit of work required to get him into the shape to take the lead role of Dalton in this particular film. And so, I mean, he talked about this in his memoir, The Time of My Life, co-written with Lisa Niemi. And he talked about working with Benny the Jet Urquidez, who was a kickboxing professional who happened not to have ever lost a professional match. And as Swayze described him, he said Benny was a short, stocky guy who used sharp, sudden moves to keep his opponents off balance. But when he tried to teach his style to me, I had a lot of trouble. It's just not the way I move. And he said I kept trying to mimic his technique, but we weren't getting anywhere. So even with the film heading towards production, Swayze wasn't really wrapping his head around the necessary fight scenes in the movie. And let's be clear about it. If you've not had the pleasure of Roadhouse before, there are a lot of fight scenes in the movie. But then Benny had a eureka moment, really. And as Swayze described it, Benny said to him, "Wait a minute, you're a dancer. I've got an idea." And he's quoting from his book. He says, "The next day he showed up on set with a boombox. He plugged it in, flipped a switch, and Michael Jackson's Thriller came blasting out. And he said that was all it took. Moving with the beat of Michael Jackson's music, I finally got a rhythm going, and my kickboxing came together." And as Swayze said, it was a great moment. All the syncopation, speed and subtlety of the art form suddenly were mine, and I loved it. And he said, I hadn't done any martial arts for a while, but after studying with Benny, I got right back into it. And he always appreciated that Roadhouse just reignited that skill for him. Now, an old friend of this podcast, Timon Singh, has written a couple of books, but I'm quoting from this one, Born to be Bad, talking to the greatest villains in action cinema. And he tracked down Benny the Jet Urquidez, and he told him about training everybody on Roadhouse ahead of production starting. And he talked about training them with fight choreography. And he explains his side of it as well, that Patrick Swayze was getting frustrated. He kept tripping over himself. He's going, what's wrong with me? I'm a dancer. Why can't I get this rhythm? And so he started choreographing the fights in the film at that stage to music. He had that eureka moment, and it all sort of worked out. One lovely nugget from Timon Singh's book as well, the person who was responsible really for getting Benny involved in Roadhouse was, of all people, Alan Rickman, because he'd been working with Alan Rickman on Die Hard, and he said Alan was an all-round great guy. He said he read the script for Joel Silver's Roadhouse, and this was known as a Joel Silver production, and he came up to me and said, you'd be perfect for this film. And he went and told Joel Silver that I was meant to be in the film, but I was so much bigger than Patrick Swayze that they didn't think it would work. So he did the training for the movie as well. Swayze was on board, Rowdy Harrington was on board, the script was in place. I mean, it had a backer in United Artists, and the budget was going to be around the $15 million mark. And Silver had his eye on another action hit. I mean, this was the era of Lethal Weapon, of Predator, Die Hard in production. And this could work along those lines as well. Their heads were being a little turned, though, by the success of Dirty Dancing. Would Patrick Swayze make an action star? Would the audience turn up for a Patrick Swayze action movie when actually they just wanted Dirty Dancing too? Well, those were problems a little bit down the line. I mean, the immediate issue was the rest of the casting. So for the crucial character of Wade, Sam Elliott and his facial hair were approached. And Elliott as well, he wasn't a fan of the script and he turned it down. But what Rowdy Herrington did was what Joel Silver had done to him. Because when Herrington raised issues with the script, Silver came in and just said, well, come and have a meeting and we'll just talk about general things. But actually what Silver was trying to do was direct him towards Roadhouse. And so Herrington invited Elliott in because he was a fan of Sam Elliott and he said he wanted to work with him. Let's talk about other projects. But again, he was just trying to lure him to Roadhouse. And they sat down and they had a chat and they said he had other projects. But in the end, Herrington just told Sam Elliott, ask for more money. I'll rewrite the script a bit for you. And that was enough in the end for Elliott. He took the advice, signed on the dotted line and duly brought his facial hair along to the location of the movie. Kelly Lynch was already on the books of United Artists, meanwhile, for the role of Doc, but she wasn't the original person cast in that role. Because for the female lead in Roadhouse, I don't think it's going a million miles, not my most radical statement really, to say that this is more a male-heavy film, but the female lead role of Doc was given to Annette Bening, and she was originally in there, but it didn't take long really for things to go wrong, and she was actually fired shortly after her casting, and the cause of that was said to be a lack of chemistry with Patrick Swayze, and then with Kelly Lynch already on the United Artists book, she was quickly brought in to replace Annette Bening in the movie. Jeff Healey plays the blind guitarist that you see in the film. Again, if you've not seen the film, it's a very odd cocktail of ingredients that make this one work. But he was cast in that role, but actually he'd been one of the inspirations for the original writers of the movie who'd seen Jeff Healey actually perform his guitar work, and then they based the guitarist character on him, and it was almost by mere coincidence really that Healey came full circle and was given the role that he'd ultimately inadvertently inspired. In terms of the main villainous role in the film, well, there were a couple of candidates for that. And the person who bubbled up first was James Garner. Now, James Garner, off the back of a lot of television work in particular, I mean, Maverick, for instance, he was offered the part and they went to a meeting at his house. But the thing is, James Garner didn't like it. And Joel Silver couldn't woo him to this one, and nor could Rowdy Herrington either, as much as there was mutual admiration for a couple of films that Garner had been involved with. It just wasn't going to happen. Ben Gazzara would ultimately take on the role of Brad Wesley, and Red West would come in the role of Red Webster. And Red West had a form really for being one of Elvis Presley's bodyguards. The cast then was ultimately in place. The script was in place, the director was in place, and so the training was still ongoing. That Benny Urquidez, who held 9 black belts in 9 different disciplines, kept training the cast. I mean, this was going to be a very, very physical production. Also, the location scouting was underway, and they went around looking for a river at one stage because that was in the screenplay as well. And as much as the film is located elsewhere in America, they ended up shooting all of this in California. But one problem that was catching Rowdy Herrington's eye just heading towards the start of filming in the spring of 1988 was the size of the script, because there was work being done on the screenplay and the script was bulging. I mean, it was up to 140 pages by the time it came to the shoot of the film. Now, the old adage with Hollywood and scripts is 1 page of script roughly equals 1 minute of screen time, and so they were staring down the barrel of a 2-hour, 20-minute action movie. And I mean, in the 1980s, that was deemed a very long time. Now that's just like an interval to whatever James Cameron's up to. The ultimate running time of Roadhouse is 114 minutes, and even at that stage Herrington knew that had to come down, and so they had a big crunch meeting, and Herrington got together with Joel Silver and they started looking at, well, what can we cut out? Which scenes don't we need to shoot? Are there any particular story elements that we don't need? But it was Joel Silver who stood his ground on everything, and he just told his director, just get down to the set and shoot everything. Just everything that's written down, shoot that. It's just going to give you a lot of options in the editing room at the end of this process. And Herrington was just like, well, here was the producer telling him to shoot absolutely everything, and so the plan was in place. He was going to pretty much shoot absolutely everything. And Herrington wasn't keen on everything that was in the script, but still, there was a green light. This was a go film. And in April 1988, off they went to California. It wasn't a long trip for them all, and filming would begin. And so Harrington knew going into this that there were lots and lots of fights. I think there are nine fights ultimately in the film, 9 big fights as well. And he was absolutely adamant too about you've got to get the stunt training right, you've got to get the stunt work right. As much as there were a lot of stunt performers on the film, nearly 50 at one stage, he also knew the actors were going to have to do a lot of the work here. This was not the era where CG could come in and take any of the heavy lifting either. This was a big physical fighting film. His star, however, Mr. Swayze, well, he was up against one or two problems doing this one, not least because he found himself for his key fights cast against an actor called Marshall Teague, playing the role of Jimmy Reno. Now, again, he talks about this in his memoir, and he was very open about the fact that Marshall Teague was clearly going into this looking to, how do I politely put it, kick Patrick Swayze's backside. And in Swayze's words, he says from the very beginning, Marshall, who played the bad guy enforcer Jimmy, told you, treated me like some snot-nosed know-nothing actor. And the thing is with Marshall Teague, he'd had a background, he'd served in Vietnam, he'd been a Navy SEAL, and as Swayze described him, he was a serious real-life badass. He had no patience for bull strip, I don't know what that is, and would say so to anyone's face. And so Marshall Teague was not massively impressed with Patrick Swayze and initially thought he could knock him over with, quote, one of his meaty fingers. Ooh. But when we started training, he learned otherwise. And what happened over the course of the shoot is Teague and Swayze, as much as there was animosity at the start, that would slowly melt away into some mutual respect. And in fact, they would become firm friends by the end of it. But that didn't stop them really going for it in the fight scenes of the movie. So there's one notable fight scene that takes place in a river, and there's a moment in it where Teague picks up a log, and as Swayze recalls, he was about to crash it over Swayze's back, believing it was a stunt log. It had been put there by the production team. And the problem there was it wasn't a stunt log. It hadn't been put there by the production team. It was, for want of a better word, a log. However, that did not stop Teague, who didn't realise this, smashing it down on Patrick Swayze's back to the point where Swayze ended up with a couple of broken ribs. However, a forerunner to Tom Cruise in a Mission Impossible film smashing his ankle up, Swayze kept going. You see this take in the film, that he kept fighting in character until cut was ultimately called. And when you see that moment in the film, as Swayze looks absolutely battered and gasping for breath, it's basically because Marshall Teague has just smashed a log on him and broken his ribs, and that's in there. Right throughout as well. I mean, Swayze had problems on Dirty Dancing with his knee joints and fluid continually having to be drained off his knee, which sounds delightful, really, doesn't it? That was happening again through Roadhouse. That he'd struggled a lot with the filming of Dirty Dancing, and a very intense action movie really wasn't doing his knee the best of the best of favours either. After the fight with Marshall Teague in the river, it was said that 2.5 ounces of fluid had to be drained off his knee. Oh, they put that on eBay now. It wasn't just Swayze and Teague doing their own stunts. I mean, Sam Elliott would reflect to the AV Club that all of the actors, to his knowledge, did their own fighting. He says, what does that say? I clicking got the chit kicked out of me. That's an odd phrase, Sam. For the entire film. And again, there were these stunt performers going at it too. And an awful lot of action. But it wasn't the actual physical fighting that would prove to be the most expensive stunt in the film. The $15 million film spent $500,000 on one sequence where, bizarrely, a monster truck it turns up in the movie. One of the characters is driving it, and that monster truck decides that, the decision is made to maraud it through a Ford garage, crushing several cars as it goes. And that one sequence in the film, which goes on for barely a minute, if that, was $500,000 just spent. And to be fair, spent and put on screen. The cars that were being smashed were real cars. They were being smashed. There's a further scene as well in the movie, as always I'm going relatively spoiler light here, where a store is blown up, and it's a fairly extensive explosion, to be fair to them. Not surprising, given that they spent $25,000 to get their one shot at that explosion as well. So it was such an explosion too that local residents, let's just say, woke them from their slumber. Now, Harrington, throughout all of this, as much as he was getting an awful lot of action and an awful lot of stunt work in camera, he still wasn't fit. He still wasn't really keen on the script. And as much as Silver was keen for him to direct everything and film everything, and in fact Joel Silver was said to be doing some second unit directing work as well, there were one or two moments that Rowdy Herrington refused to film, or Howard. Should we call him Howard? Let's go with Howard for now. And one of the things that Howard was reluctant to film, and indeed didn't, was, well, a castration moment that does not appear in the movie, but is in the screenplay that they'd agreed before they started shooting. The physical endurance that required from Swayze was quite something, and that knee injury did keep meaning his knee was having to be drained and having to be drained and having to be drained. And he was also attracting attention on location as well, because this was primarily a location shoot. Swayze had turned into one of the world's biggest movie stars off the back of Dirty Dancing, and it would be fair to say that people who were relatively enamoured of Patrick Swayze when they saw he was in the local area were, well, how do we put it, also rather keen to meet him, to the point where he was getting mobbed on location as well. But still, they got the film done. The film was shot and done by the summer of 1988. And so it was Rowdy Herrington then into the edit suite to try and wrestle all of this material that he'd shot into a final cut. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the original cut of the movie was coming in around the 3-hour mark. And it's quite well known that quite a lot of material ended up being cut out of Roadhouse in the post-production phase of the movie. So scenes that got the chop include a fight sequence with Keith David, for instance. In fact, quite a lot of fighting ended up out of the film. Then there were the bits that just weren't shot in the first place. But gradually over time, Herrington managed to shave the film down to under 2 hours. And in came Michael Kamen as well to do the score for the film. Now, Michael Kamen, a brilliant composer and a much missed composer as well, had also been working on Die Hard. And I rewatched Roadhouse ahead of just putting this podcast together, and there's no way around it. He's reusing music from Die Hard in Roadhouse. You just can't get away from that at all. The film was ready for cinemas in May of 1989. It was originally going to be out in March. They just delayed it very, very slightly. Went before critics, and what do you know? Here's a sweaty action film with a drenched Patrick Swayze, and the reviews weren't great. I mean, they were in the middle at best, really. But as much as Roadhouse has become heavily appreciated over time by a certain segment of the audience, of which I am a proud member, the initial critical response to it was just not great at all. It was fine. It was okay at best. It was entertaining. I mean, it was almost dismissed as cheesy fun, really, as well. But the hope was still it would overcome that, and much as Die Hard had managed to do, much as Lethal Weapon had managed to do, it would carve itself out a fair amount of change at the US box office. And so it opened that week of March the 19th to the 21st, and United Artists launched it into a fairly competitive field, but it was the biggest new release of that week, and it landed in second place with a 5.9 million opening weekend, which isn't really that bad by 1980s standards. The other big opener was a film called How I Got Into College that 20th Century Fox released, and I don't know anyone who's even heard of that particular film now. Fright Night Part 2 was out that week as well. For Queen and Country was around, I think that was early Denzel Washington, just off the top of my head. And Miracle Mile was just outside the top 20. But the number one movie that week was the reunion of Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder in See No Evil, Hear No Evil, which held the top spot it had had the previous week. Grossed $6.1 million. The greatest film of all time was in third place at the box office that week. That would be Field of Dreams. Might be biased. K9 was in fourth. Pet Sematary, Major League, Rain Man, they were all around. I mean, Rain Man had been around for nearly half a year at that stage. Scandal was in the top 10. The Dream Team was there, and Say Anything was rounding out the list. But the trick at this stage, I mean, in the 1980s, you weren't judged on your opening weekend. You were judged on, well, could you bring in the repeat business? And the thing is, with Roadhouse, would it hang around? Well, it sort of did. So by 2 weeks later, I mean, it was still in the top 10. It was down to 6th place against films. I mean, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade had come along the week before and just dominated the box office. Renegades was around as well. No Holds Barred, that was in the top 10. So it was fairly competitive. But Roadhouse would hold its own for a few weeks. Star Trek V would be out June the 9th, and that took the top spot while Roadhouse contented itself with 7th place. It was down to 8th the following week when Ghostbusters 2 came along, and then Batman came out, on June the 23rd in the US, and that just changed everything. And so Roadhouse, by the time it had completed its run, it had done $30 million in US cinema, and that was judged as a disappointment, really, certainly by Joel Silver's standards. He was looking for another Die Hard, and as much as the film made another $30 million outside of the US, this really wasn't the kind of number he was looking for. And it was marked down really as a disappointment all round, which through modern eyes just seems a bit odd. I mean, it's worth noting that such was the response to it that the Golden Raspberry Awards, remember the Razzies, decided to nominate Roadhouse for Worst Picture of the Year, Worst Director, Worst Actor, amongst any things. I think that probably tells you all you need to know about the Golden Raspberry Awards, really. At least it didn't give them any of the gongs, but you know, really. Patrick Swayze, while he was doing Roadhouse as well, Joel Silver wanted to work with him again and offered him more action roles. I mean, he was sounded out. I think it's fairly well known he was sounded out about Predator 2. I read he was also in the running for Tango and Cash as well. But the strain on his body really was something that Swayze couldn't ignore, and the idea of going into such another physically intensive film straight off the back of doing Roadhouse, well, it was pretty much a non-starter as far as Swayze was concerned. The film that he would move on to next, well, it still had an action element to it actually. It was the film Next of Kin opposite Liam Neeson, but that was more an action thriller than a straight action film. And then rather than doing Predator 2, he opted to do Ghost. And that didn't work out too badly for him, really, before he would jump back into the world of action in Point Break, which I will come to on a future episode of this podcast. I should note as well, of course, we lost Patrick Swayze way too early, with so many more great roles to come. Roadhouse rightly stands as one of the favourites amongst his extensive filmography of movies. And he took some really, he took some real risks and he took some real chances in his career every time he had a big hit. For instance, following up the likes of Ghost and Point Break with City of Joy was a pretty bold move. Now, the Roadhouse story actually wasn't done. In fact, to this day, it's still not done either, because as much as there wasn't an awful lot of enthusiasm for further chapters around the time of its release, come the 2000s and the DVD boom, Hollywood was digging into its back catalogue and looking for films that it could make direct-to-DVD sequels to, nice and cheap ones, really, and eventually the fickle finger of fate pointed at Roadhouse. And so in 2006, we were treated, inverted commas, to Roadhouse 2, Last Call, which came out, never saw the inside of a cinema and never will. And this was set after the original Roadhouse, and it would pick up the son of Patrick Swayze's character. None of the original cast and crew really returned for this one. In fact, they kill off the character of Dalton, as I understand it, in Roadhouse 2, Last Call. But then, even then, that couldn't kill it completely off. There was an off-Broadway musical in 2003, and then there was talk of a remake, and that really surfaced for the first time in earnest in 2015, when actor and wrestler Ronda Rousey was said to be taking on the lead role in a new take on Roadhouse. And this looked like it was getting a little bit far down the line as well. Nick Cassavetes was going to write and direct the film, but a year later, the project was dead. Even then, though, that's not the end of the road, because at the point this podcast is being recorded, a remake of Roadhouse is in production. And now it's under the watchful eye of Edge of Tomorrow and Bourne Identity director Doug Liman. Jake Gyllenhaal is taking on the lead role this time, and also in the cast, Conor McGregor, Billy Magnussen is in there, Daniela Melchior, and it's Amazon, who now own MGM, that's putting up the funds for this one. And the idea is the new Roadhouse, whatever it is called, will debut on the Prime Video service at some point. It hasn't debuted at the point that this is recording. I would just state the obvious on this. It's going to take a hell of a job to really beat the original film, because this is one of the films that, even though it didn't set the box office alight on its original release, it has continually built its audience over time and is a much loved film of the 1980s. In the US, the label Vinegar Syndrome has just put out a really extensive 4K disc version of it as well, which the budget doesn't quite stretch to, but a film very deserving of it. May an extensive 4K disc version become more affordable and spread right around the world. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I'm going to do my little bit of parish notices just in the middle of this episode. So if you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it, and I appreciate all or any of them. Firstly, if you want to support it financially, I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Now, in exchange for you putting a few coins in the pot there, you get the podcast early, pretty much every week. You get it advertising free as well. And you also find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. You'll find out about special episodes early and live shows and things early as well. Costing you absolutely nothing is subscribing to the podcast. I hugely appreciate it. If you do that, that helps algorithms and just like helps small independent podcasts like this one just bubble up a little bit, and likewise leaving ideally a hugely positive review. I'm thankful for everyone who's been doing that, and I know quite a lot of you have been. It really does help enormously. Thank you so much. At the point this is being released, I've got a live show coming up on Wednesday, the 18th of January in Birmingham. That is in the year 2023, depending quite when you're accessing that. That's at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham in the UK. I'm also going to be back in London on Thursday, the 23rd of February 2023 at King's Place, where I'm bringing my Movie Geek live show. You'll find details of all the shows at filmstories.co.uk. But I think that's pretty much it as far as parish notices go. I'm going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Moving forward a decade or 2 now, I'm going to do a bit of motor racing. Let me play you a clip. Come to the story. The other side of this.
The closer you are to death, the more alive you feel.
You're James, aren't you?
Yes. Who's that?
It's Nicky Lauda. He's just been signed by Ferrari.
He's a nobody.
Look at the way he's driving, like an old man.
Right now, with 0 incentive, why would I drive fast?
Because I'm asking you to.
This is an incredible battle between these 2 great drivers.
Next time, I'll have you.
No chance. You're just a party guy. That's why everybody likes you.
Yes, I know, I'm terrible.
No, you're not terrible. You're just who you are at this point in your life.
To be a champion, it takes more than just being quick.
You have to really believe it.
I've been waiting for this my whole life.
I can beat this guy, trust me.
He's consistent, dependable.
Will he put his life on the line the day that really matters?
Welcome to the racing grudge match of the decade.
And that racing grudge match of the decade is told in the 2013 story Rush, directed by Ron Howard, written by Peter Morgan, and starring Chris Hemsworth, Daniel Bruhl, Olivia Wilde, Alexandra Maria Lara, and Pier Francesco Favino. So the story of Rush, well, this is an independent film story, even though it might not look so on the surface. And so, come the start of the 2010s, Hollywood studios, I think it's pretty well known, well, they'd had their heads firmly turned by franchises and superheroes and sequels and blockbusters. They were making fewer films, but they were making bigger films. And that was the mantra most of the major studios were following. And that was squeezing out filmmakers who you ordinarily wouldn't necessarily think would struggle to get their movies funded. So Steven Spielberg famously struggled for a while to get the money to make his movie Lincoln, for instance. And then there was Ron Howard coming off the back of the Robert Langdon films with Tom Hanks, not great films, but very lucrative, and the Best Picture nominated Frost Nixon. And it turned out even he was struggling to get money out of a Hollywood studio. So we come to Rush, an independent movie produced by a man called Andrew Eaton of Revolution Films, and he was one of the very first on board this particular project, and it came up against the demise of mid-budget filmmaking in Hollywood. So let's dive back just a little bit more to 2010, really. So the idea to bring the story of Formula One drivers James Hunt and Niki Lauda to the screen, they're telling the story of their intense rivalry in the world of 1970s Formula One. Well, it had been percolating for a while. Peter Morgan, by this stage, a writer who'd enjoyed success with the likes of The Queen and The Damned United and the aforementioned Frost Nixon, he'd been shaping a screenplay for a story, having been talked to by a producer from America who asked him if he would be interested in penning a tale about Formula One in the 70s. And as he told McLaren Racing, my initial instinct was not really, because I'm not really a Formula One fan. But he did a few days of research, and that's where he tapped into the rivalry between two Formula One drivers, James Hunt and Niki Lauda. And that was really his way into the story. And so Peter Morgan had worked with Andrew Eaton on a previous film, 360, and the pair had a relationship really where Morgan felt comfortable showing him the first draft of the script. And Andrew Eaton took a look at the first draft of the script and he wanted in. And Morgan had gone about this, and Eaton went about this as well, with the idea of let's make a film that costs $50 million but could feel like $150 million. Now, Morgan went into his process a little bit, talking to Script Mag, and he told how he couldn't meet with the late James Hunt for fairly obvious reasons, but he would interview 30 or so people to work out just how to put his character across on screen. He did have access, however, to the other part of the story, Niki Lauda. Niki Lauda, who died a couple of years ago, but was very much live and kicking at this stage. Morgan would say of him, I met with only one person to put together Niki, and that was obviously Niki. And he said, nobody in the world will like Niki in the first meeting. You only get to like Niki over time. He's impossible to like. He's so self-focused and self-advancing and brutal. And so the first meeting between the pair was on the testing side, but they had more conversations, and gradually Morgan found his way into Niki Lauda's character, and he started to fashion that screenplay, the first draft of which he would show Andrew Eaton, and Rush was up and running. Now, the first person on board to direct, well, this was a bit of a coup. Paul Greengrass, who'd just come off the back of The Bourne Supremacy and The Bourne Ultimatum, and his star was particularly high, and it seemed like a logical project for him as well. And also, it looked like a fairly logical green light to give, because now you had a Peter Morgan script, you had Paul Greengrass directing, and then Morgan also showed the script to a man called Eric Fellner, one of the co-founders of Working Title, a hugely successful British production company allied to Universal Pictures. And so Fellner took the script to Universal Pictures. Here are all the ingredients for a film. And that's where really things started to go wrong for a little while for this project, because Universal just simply couldn't see the global appeal in it. And to be fair to the studio, it did have a little bit of a point that Universal had very much an eye on the American market as well as the global one. And Formula One in America, well, there were very, very significant concerns about whether a Formula One film would perform at the American box office when Formula One's such a minority sport, particularly in America, at the point they were going around shaking tins to try and get the funding together. And so Universal it didn't see it, and nor did the studio really think that the film that was detailed in Peter Morgan's script could actually be made for $50 million. The fact that Paul Greengrass, it had experience with Paul Greengrass as well, and Greengrass did a lot of reshooting work on his Bourne movies. And so perhaps that was an ingredient in there as well. The bottom line was Universal just didn't see it and turned it down. And so, I mean, that particular path was that. That was the best shot at getting a Hollywood studio to pony up the cash to make the film. However, even though Universal didn't jump aboard, Eric Fellner stayed on the project, and he'd had some experience in Formula One movies because he was one of the people involved in Asif Kapadia's extraordinary documentary Senna. And what that meant for the production of Rush was that Fellner had relationships in place with the world of Formula One, in particular with the two manufacturers that were going to be heavily depicted in the film, McLaren and Ferrari, and thus he could negotiate the permissions required to use their branding and their name in the movie. Formula One, notoriously a protective sport as well. You had to get past its gatekeeper, Bernie Eccleston, to get permission to present it on screen. And Fellner was able to grease the metaphorical wheels there. However, even with all of the things in its corner, really, it became clear that the money to make the movie, that $50 million, I mean, a fairly modest sum for what they were looking to do, well, it wasn't going to come from the studios, and they were going to need independent funding to do it. Now, Eaton had set this up as a British independent film anyway, and he was used to going out and raising funds for his films, and he got an early success with this, and he said that this was a pivotal moment, really. A man called Brian Oliver of a company called Cross Creek Pictures. Now, Cross Creek Pictures had put money into films like The Ides of March and Black Swan. Its money didn't come from the traditional film industry. It actually came from Texas-based oil and real estate incomes. But Brian Oliver saw something fairly instantly in the film and put in $2 million of cash before he'd even signed his deal for Cross Creek to be one of the co-producers on it. Now, this cash was really important because what that meant was some of the pre-production work could begin, in particular building the replicas of the 1970s Formula One cars required for certain parts of the shooting in time for production, because that was going to take time. That process needed to begin because without that you wouldn't have a start date for the film. And so there was a bit of money in the bank, the work was underway, and finally it looked like it had got a path forward, which was when Paul Greengrass walked away. Now, a couple of stories as to why that might be. He was juggling competing projects anyway when he was looking attached to Rush. But also, it was reported that he was struggling to see the budget that he had and with that money being able to realise the film he wanted to. And so that was a consideration. But also, another project was crossing his desk as well, a film called Captain Phillips that he would ultimately go on and make with Tom Hanks. Now, one person who was also involved with Captain Phillips was a filmmaker by the name of Ron Howard. Wouldn't you know it? Ron Howard had directed Frost Nixon, of course. And so there was, ostensibly there was a little bit of a swap of projects here, in that Greengrass would take on Captain Phillips and Howard would be offered the opportunity to take on Rush. Now, it was a film he'd had a look at before and was aware of, but he was involved at the point it was initially crossing his desk with another project that he'd been trying to get moving, a big screen adaptation of Stephen King's Dark Tower, which was a real time drain for Howard for a while to try and get that going. It wouldn't be him ultimately that got that moving, but for a period of time that was his focus. But that adaptation of Dark Tower was victim really again to that squeeze on Hollywood studios and the films that they were choosing to make. And so when Greengrass dropped out, Peter Morgan and Fellner got in touch with Howard, who knew of it, but also was having trouble getting Dark Tower moving. And within 24 hours, he had this gap in his schedule and he was in. And he gave an interview saying he was, even though he knew nothing really about Formula One, he did accept that Formula One in the 70s was, quote, when sex was safe and driving was dangerous, as he said in a couple of interviews. And he was intrigued enough to sign on the dotted line with a film that was already moving. And perhaps that was part of the attraction, that he'd been stuck in development hell on a project for a little while. And here was one that had a start line that he ultimately had to hit. He thus got to work, quickly immersing himself in the world of Formula One. He went to the Monaco Grand Prix, quickly got hooked on it. And as he was putting the work together, he just saw enough in it. He saw the film that he wanted to make. But also this was a step outside his usual comfort zone, because Ron Howard was and primarily is a Hollywood studio director. You know, Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, even going back to film like Splash. These were all films made by Hollywood studios with the comfort blanket of Hollywood studio money as well. But here he was making a sizable movie on an independent budget and working also for the first time with a completion bond company. Now, if you're not familiar with the work of completion bond companies, these are the organisations that basically guarantee the film that will be made on the budget that's required, on the schedule that's required. And if the filmmaker looks like they're going off track there, then the completion bond company can take over the film and make the creative decisions and chop and change so that it does hit that budget and it does hit that schedule. And so what this meant for Howard was a fresh challenge for him, really, that not only was that start line there ahead of him, he also knew he couldn't go over schedule, he couldn't go over budget, and there was just little in the way of a safety net on this one. This was a risky project from top to bottom. And while all this was going on, while Howard was wrestling that, Andrew Eaton was out trying to find the rest of the money as well. And so he got some luck as well. Exclusive Media, for instance, signed up, put in some funds. Then in 2011, Eaton took the project to the American film market. And this was key, really, because they could pre-sell the overseas rights and do pre-sales agreements. This brought in $33 million And that was a large chunk of the change they needed to get the movie going. Then Andrew Eaton and Brian Oliver also set the film up as a UK and German co-production, and that allowed them to qualify for various pots of funding and various breaks and benefits as well. And what had happened really was they managed to jigsaw together the $50 million from a whole range of sources, with the nice irony that in the end, Universal, which didn't necessarily believe that the film had a lot of potential in the US market, wouldn't you know, it signed up for the US distribution rights. Studio Canal picked it up here in the UK. And so the film's funded through a labyrinth system of organisations and methods, really. And so then we look in front of the camera because it was casting time. And Chris Hemsworth, at this point, was a person who was enjoying how the Hollywood studio system had gone. He was Thor. And in fact, at the point he came onto the radar of Rush, he was filming the first Avengers movie when he auditioned for the role of James Hunt in the film. And he put on a British accent. And Ron Howard would talk to race fans about when Chris Hemsworth crossed his radar, and he talked about how Kenneth Branagh, who directed Thor, said he really had a lot to offer as an actor, and Anthony Hopkins had told Peter Morgan the same thing, that he'd known him from the film 360, for instance. And so what happened was, in the end, Hemsworth taped an audition of himself. He filmed one of the scenes, he put the accent on, he really went for it. And Howard was taken with him very, very quickly and pretty much said yes on the spot to Chris Hemsworth taking on the role of James Hunt. But also Peter Morgan was very fixed on Daniel Bruhl being the top choice to play Niki Lauda. Now, there was some resistance, ironically here, from German financiers who were pushing for an American co-star for the movie. They felt that would be more lucrative, but the filmmakers here held their ground. And Bruhl talked about getting the job and what it entailed with Hero magazine. He said once he got it, he said the first thing I did was get to a Formula 3 course to actually learn how to drive a racing car. Then I spent a month in Vienna with an accent coach to get my accent right. He tried to study the body language, he said, of Niki Lauda. And he said some actors don't like to meet the actual person, but I wanted to, as I had so many questions. But would Daniel Bruhl find Niki Lauda any more amenable than Peter Morgan had? Well, here's a quote for you, that he found Lauda, quote, as undiplomatic in real life as he is in the movie. Now, speaking to F1 Fanatic, I mean, Howard talked to lots of outlets on the promotion tour for this, as he had to. He was selling an independent film again. He talked about how casting the cars alone was just a huge challenge, which, quote, threatened our budget in the early stages of making the movie. And the film's investors put up some funds so that they could do what was described as exploratory filming at a race circuit, a Formula One race circuit. And for Howard, that was, quote, a huge break moment. He said, we were just picking out the cars in the race that were appropriate to our season. They decided to zero the story in on the 1976 Formula One season. And he said, well, we actually got some shots that are in the movie. We learned a hell of a lot, because they went to the Nürburgring circuit and shot some of the footage there. And, quote, the visit answered some important questions about the balance between real action and CGI, because they worked out what they could do in camera, and that changed a lot from their original perception of it, and what they needed to do in the computer. And as Howard described it, a lot of our budget shifted out of digital into practical. It had taken many, many months of prep for Rush to be able to go before the cameras, but that's what happened. February the 22nd, 2012, the first official shots were in the can. The movie would shoot mainly in the UK and Germany. Again, that helped it qualify for some of the funding, to plug some of the funding gaps that it was after. There was a little bit of work in Austria too. And the heart of the challenge that Howard had to capture was around a dozen Formula One races that needed to be restaged as part of the production. And this was a mix of digital and of practical work. Howard described this to Post magazine. He said, we shot all the race sequences in Britain and Germany, and they doubled for all the other tracks as well. And they started at the Nürburgring course in Germany. But at that point, one or two members of the effects team were still working on another film as well. But on the other side of that, they'd already done some pre-visualization work as well. But then Howard was willing to veer from it a little bit when needed, because he knew these Formula One sequences needed to be realistic. I mean, they couldn't really use real Formula One cars So they used a lot of redressed Formula 3 cars as well, some of which were owned by private collectors who would drive them for them as well. And just to capture just what some of the physical filming was like, it was described as on one day of action, 35 cameras were in play, which includes some of the cameras that were fixed to the cars as well. Howard had a challenge of, it's almost a Star Wars challenge, that he was looking to shoot dramatic moments while the camera was gazing at people with helmets on, really. But lots of cameras in there, which also meant an awful lot of footage that was going to be needed to be sorted through in post-production as well. And I mean, Howard would talk about the months of editing that was going to be required and the mixing of the soundtrack, which was done in Germany as well, and the getting all of the engine sounds just right. And that was even before the score came in from Hans Zimmer as well. But Rush, I mean, it wrapped production in May of 2012, and there was a good year really to get the film completed, although Howard would ultimately sign it off in the early stages of 2013. Now, the VFX supervisor on the film was Jodie Johnson, working at the company Double Negative, based in London. And there were around 700 VFX shots that you see in the movie in the end. And these were described as just brushstrokes and rig removal stuff for a lot of it. But also, we had our big moments where cars are crashing and then things where it's just too dangerous and too expensive and too unpredictable to try and do any other way except with VFX. Now, the film, nice and completed, meant that a distribution strategy could be considered, and it was clear they were going to put this into festivals first, but also it had lots of distributors around the world. Universum in Germany, Universal in the US, Studio Canal in the UK, lots of different investors and stakeholders in it. And so, in the end, what they decided to do was debut the movie at the Toronto International Film Festival, although the way things would fall, it was actually in UK cinemas by the time it got its festival premiere there. Before it was seen by the public as well, Howard had shown it to leading Formula One drivers ahead of that. He'd also shown it to Niki Lauda, and Niki Lauda was really quite taken with it and lamented really that James Hunt wasn't there to see it, that their story had been brought to the screen in such extraordinary fashion. It wasn't just Niki Lauda that was a fan either. The critical response to Rush was really favourable, actually. Lots of people really went out to bat for the film. The race sequences in particular were highlighted, as are the core two performances between Chris Hemsworth and Daniel Bruhl. And the general feeling of the film is this is really good. And so, in fact, it would attract lots and lots of interest from lots of award bodies around the world, with the exception of the Academy Awards, as it happened. I mean, it won a BAFTA at one point. It got nominated in several other award shows, but the Oscar snub was a strange one, not least because the film was acclaimed and it had strong acting performances in it, but also it proven to be successful as well. And so let's focus on the US release of this, because what Universal decided to do was treat this almost like a kind of awards independent film, in that it opened it on just 5 screens in the US the weekend of September the 20th to the 22nd, played in the UK for a couple of weeks by this point. And Rush opened in 38th place, but with $187,000. But the crucial thing here was the screen average was $37,457. I mean, that was a really good return. It wasn't the biggest return. I mean, Enough Said was starring the late James Gandolfini. That also opened on a small number of screens that week. That did a 58,000 screen average, but still really strong numbers. The number one movie that week actually was Prisoners, which got a wide release on over 3,000 screens, brought in $20 million. Covered that on a previous episode. Universal then expanded Rush's screen count dramatically the following week. It was playing on nearly 2,500 screens, went straight up to third place. With a $10 million gross. They're against openers such as Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2. That was the number one film that week. Baggage Claim opened in fourth place. That got $9 million. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt's directorial debut, Don John, that opened with $8.6 million. And then Rush would do all right business. I mean, some of Universal's fears really were realised that there wasn't a massive amount of passion for a Formula One movie. And the fact that competition was coming, mean, Gravity came out the week after. That did really, really strong numbers. Captain Phillips then came out. That was a hit as well. But by the time that Rush left US cinemas, it had still put, $27 million in the tank. Overseas, outside of the US, another 68 million. And this movie that in the end, I mean, the budget, depending which source you believe, of $40 to $50 million, had taken brought in a global take of 98.2 million, ahead of success on DVD as well. And for effectively what was at heart, and what it remains at heart, a small independent British film that actually didn't turn out that small after all, that's really quite an impressive result. Ron Howard would hang around the UK for his next film, which was a studio movie again, In the Heart of the Sea, but he would notably use quite a lot of the crew that he'd come to know on Rush as well. And I think if you go back to Rush as well, it is just a really impressive tale and a really well chosen way to do a biopic as well. Depending which part of the world you're in, you get a different distributor just to pick it up, but it is worth, I'd suggest, making the effort. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you absolutely completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project, and there's a lot of the Film Stories project at Film Stories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews and features. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find our print magazines for sale, as well as our sneakers Blu-ray. We've got Film Stories magazine, we've got Film Junior magazine. There's all sorts there. We're at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline and at youtube.com/filmstories as well. And I think that's about it, isn't it? The main thing, as always, is you all look after yourselves. I thank you so much for listening, and I thank you for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.